Hi, my name's Ken Horowitz from Sega16.com, and you're watching the Sega Lounge. Or listening. Should be listening, right?
Can be both, actually. Yeah, good. Welcome to the Sega Lounge, where we celebrate our love for all things Sega, including the games, the music, and the community. I'm your host, KC. Join me as I talk to different guests and learn more about their projects and passion for Sega. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sega Lounge. It's a real pleasure to be back with another episode of the show. We have a great one for you this week. We have a returning guest, but before we actually talk about that, let me just welcome everyone to the show and remember that we are actually posting finally on our YouTube channel. So if you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel, you can actually find either clips, video clips of our interviews, or actually the full thing. Yeah, which is something that I'm starting to do. So be sure to check it out. The Sega Lounge on YouTube. It's easy to find, so do check that out. And without further ado, it's a pleasure to welcome back to the show returning guests returning for the second time. So this is his third appearance on the Sega Lounge, Ken Horowitz. Hello, Ken. Welcome.
Hello.
Very nice to have you again on the show. It's been a while. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for having me back. I appreciate it.
Well, always a pleasure to have you. So, for people not familiar with your works in the Sega community, I'll just go. I'll just say Sega16.com. So that's the easiest way for people to say, oh, that's the guy. However, and people can go back and listen to like a more detailed introduction of how you started and everything by going back to our previous episodes, which I'll link in the show notes. But very briefly, for people who might not really, be familiar with your work, with your website, would you care to tell us what Sega 16 is and how it started?
Okay, well, Sega 16 is a website that documents Sega's arcade and console legacy. We do reviews, we do features, and interviews about events, games, and people that are involved in Sega's history in any way, from when they started making arcade games to when they left hardware with the Sega Dreamcast. And the website began in June of 2004 and turns 20 this year. We have, I think, over 120 interviews with writers, with programmers, designers, artists, producers, executives, even former presidents of Sega of America, um, and
Mhm.
people from Sega Europe and other parts of the world, including Brazil.
Yeah.
And we have, I think, we have over 1,000 reviews and all kinds of good features and interesting articles that have been posted by an army of contributors and myself over the past 20 years.
Excellent, excellent. And so congrats, first of all, for turning 20 this year, which is
Hello?
amazing. It's a milestone. Amazing. And I urge people to actually check out Sega16.com. You actually did there we go, like a retrospective that people can find. People watching the video version will be able to see this briefly, but there's a really nice retrospective that you posted when the website turned 20, and it's a really nice read. And this is a really nice way for people to know a little bit about the history behind Sega16.com and how it all started. And some of the people involved as well. Um, if you had to pick, Ken, like it's probably really hard, but one moment, like the moment in the history, in the 20 years of history of Sega16.com, that was the either the most important, the one that you hold dearest, which would it be?
I think my proudest moment, I would say, or the highest moment in Sega 16's history was when I published the article of the behind the design or the making of Disney's Aladdin for the Sega Genesis. I still think today that that is the single best thing I've ever written for the website because I was able to go so in depth for that article. I was able to talk from people from the original Blue Sky team, as well as just a whole bunch of people from the Virgin Games team. I even got to speak to the man who animated the Sultan in the actual movie. And so that was really, really proud of how complete and in depth that article was. And I think that it's probably the best thing I've ever written. And I think my what in the 20 years, I think that that was uh, the high point for
Okay,
me.
nice, nice, yeah. So people should actually check out Sega16.com. Highly recommended source of information as well. And you are, we actually talked about this, I think, last time you were on the show. The research part is what you really like, enjoy doing, right? Because of your
Mhm.
professional background as well, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's what my biggest interest is documenting and doing the chronology of Sega's history. I like unearthing the stories that no one has heard before, speaking to people about things that haven't been discussed, and just discovering that new information and bringing that to light and letting people use that as a foundation for them to do their own research on is really satisfying. And I'm seeing people today writing books and doing articles and videos and things using Sega 16 as a source, and that's really gratifying and makes me very happy.
Yeah, yeah, I bet. Yeah, and we last time you were on the show, you we talked about one of your books, "Playing at the Next Level,"
Mhm.
which was, I think, the only one that was out at the time. So that's how long ago you came on the show, and how
Yeah.
long overdue this comeback was. But I still think I went back before we when we were like chatting about you returning to the show. I went back to the book as well, and I still feel like it's a great source of information. Uh, it's not people talk about like the Blake J. Harris book Console Wars as, and it's more of like a marketing approach to the this console wars and like the history of Sega and Nintendo. But you went for a different approach. You went for the development teams approach, like
Mhm.
the behind the scenes of making the games themselves, which is quite interesting. And I still think it's a valuable piece of information for people wanting to understand more about that period of Sega's history. So again, people should check it out, right? But ever
Yes, please
since
buy one, buy 10.
exactly 100, uh, after you came on the show, you actually and you teased that when you came on the show, but you released the Sega Arcade Revolution, right?
Hmm.
Which is a little bit different. So not so much focused on the home console, especially like the Genesis at the time, but more the arcade side of things. Uh, what is this book about for people not in the know?
Well, the Sega Arcade Revolution covers Sega's arcade history from 1963 to 2003 when they merged with Sammy.
Hmm.
And I stopped it at 2003 because that's when the Sega that we have known up to that point ceased to exist and became a whole new thing. And it goes in chronological order, discusses the foundation of the company, the founding and development, and it just starts with its electromechanical games and covers games like Jetpack and Periscope and Missile, and then it goes through its arcade history. It covers hits like Zaxxon and Space Harrier and Outrun and Altered Beast and Golden Axe, and I try to go as in depth as possible, as depth as I could, for the development of each of those games. And there are interviews with people who worked at Gremlin, Sega Gremlin, people who worked at Sega, people who worked at Sega Amusements, as well as a whole bunch of Japanese language documents that were translated to English for the first time. So, like when you read the section on Power Drift or the section on columns, there's a lot of information there that was never available in English before, and it covers 62 of Sega's arcade uh, games. I would have loved to cover them all, but the book would have been the size of a phone book. It would have been like this thick. So, and I would have had to do multiple volumes. Every time I write one of those books, I'm very happy with them. And then after a while, I start to see things I wanted to include or should have included or things that I could have said more about. And I would like to do a revised and expanded version. So hopefully
Mhm.
one day I'll be able to do that and add more.
I was gonna ask that. Is that in the works or not? No, maybe not yet, right?
Well, of all the books, I would like to do Playing at the Next Level. I would like to revise that one. That was the
Mm,
first one I did. I could add many more games. There were people that I couldn't talk to back then that weren't around or weren't available for conversation that they are now. Also, back in 2015, there weren't as many game books of this type, and so people weren't really as open to the idea. Now I think people
mhm.
would be more receptive. There are more games that we know about that we didn't know about back then that I really would have liked to have included. So I think I could probably uh, almost double the size of that book if I had the chance.
Okay. Okay.
But that
Yeah,
all depends if the publisher decides.
I'd love to see that, to read that. Actually, I think um, out of the two books, that's my favorite. That's the one that means the most to me, because the like the Mega Drive in my case is a very special console, my first console. So it's got a very special place in my heart. But the arcade revolution is also interesting, especially considering that when we think of arcade and Sega arcade games, we think of like those games that you mentioned at the end of that answer that you gave me, like Space Harrier, Altered Beast, something like that, and we don't really remember like the very beginning of what Sega did in the arcade, like those electromechanical games and stuff. And that's
It's
very interesting.
important to document that and discuss it because many people think that Sega lost, Sega failed when they stopped making consoles. And first of all, Sega has been out of the console industry now longer than it was in it.
That's true.
But Sega made arcade games for almost 25 years before it made its first console, and they've been making games for over 20 years since their last console. And they never stopped in between. Sega has always been a coin op company.
Mhm.
And consoles was just another area that it entered, just like it entered arcades. It ran arcades, had Sega Center, Time Out, and other arcades, just like it had Pizza Time. Was it Pizza? PJ Pizzazz. PJ Pizzazz, which was like a Chuck E. Cheese Pizza Time theater thing. Sega, it had Sega World. Sega has always tried and dipped itself into different
Yeah.
businesses, and consoles was just one of them. But arcades has always been what coin up has always been what Sega is, and I think it's important to make that point and show people, especially as arcades have kind of become more of a novelty thing now. Like, oh, I'm going to go to this barcade or arcade. It's not like it was back in the day that there were video games on every corner and every pharmacy or every supermarket had an arcade game. Had arcade games in them. So I think as we get farther away from that, and younger generations, can grow up and never see an arcade game in some places. in the wild, I think it's important that that history be documented.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, yeah. So the Sega Arcade Revolution also available for people to buy. So like again, 100 copies. Feel free to. Uh, yeah. Okay. But and a quick aside, we're a Sega podcast, but you actually went beyond that in your book writing, right? So you also wrote a book about Nintendo arcade games,
Mhm.
which maybe between like Sega arcade games and Nintendo arcade games, people are probably more familiar with Sega's arcade business. Uh, they know of Donkey Kong. So the book is aptly titled Beyond Donkey Kong, right? And you also wrote a book about the Williams Midway arcade
Mhm.
business, right? So what motivated you to write these two other games? Was it like the same as the reason why you did the Sega one to document the arcade history and for people to be more aware of that?
Well, that's part of it. But when I was a kid and I used to go to arcades, I used to play Sega arcade games. I used to play Nintendo arcade games, and I used to play William arcade games. I would put lots and lots of money into Verse Baseball, into Mario Brothers and Popeye and Donkey Kong, and I would put a lot of money into Joust and Defender and Robotron, and I would play Sega arcade games, Wonder Boy and others. And so I wrote the book on Sega because I love Sega and I love their arcade games. But I wanted to write about the Nintendo and the Williams arcade games because I grew up with those too. And no one had done that. When people, I mean, if you want to read a book about Nintendo's console business, like the NES and the Famicom, you could probably build a table with all the different books on the NES history that have been released because when you say Nintendo history, people think NES, Super Nintendo, Game Boy, right? And no one had talked about Nintendo's arcade business. And if it hadn't been for their arcade business, there wouldn't be an NES and a Super Nintendo and a Game Boy. And I think that was a big gap, a big hole in Nintendo's history that no one had filled. And so I wanted to do that. And because I grew up and loved those games, Punch Out and all that, I wanted to tell that story. The same thing with the Williams. And the Williams, I think, actually, of all the books that I've written, the Williams one is was my favorite to write because there's just so much incredible history. I actually, with that book, that's the biggest book I've written. I actually had to get my publisher to let me increase the word count twice. And then I went over the word count by like 8,000 words. And I still had to leave stuff out because there's just so much history there. And the people who work there were the ones I spoke to, and were just so cooperative and so happy that someone, was telling that story,
Yeah, yeah,
and they were so eager to share, and they gave me photos and everything because you, more so than that, and that's because Nintendo and Sega are mostly Japanese companies, right?
yeah.
Williams was an American company run by Americans, so these people, you had people there who worked there for decades,
Hmm.
and so they love Williams, and they don't want to see it forgotten. And so it was just wonderful to be able to talk with those people and share. Hey, you love making those games. I love playing them.
Yeah.
Let's tell this story.
And
And
they
so it
probably
was
don't get
wonderful.
enough like credit and recognition as well, right? They're not
Well, you have
people don't speak
some
about them so much.
some people like Eugene Jarvis. Everybody knows who Eugene Jarvis is, right? Um, but there are other people, George Gomez, who made Monster Bash. He also worked at Bally on Spy Hunter and Tron.
Hmm.
And uh, there are a lot of people in that company that came over from Bally when Williams bought Bally in 1988. But you have all these people who were there, for early on, like Barry Ausler, who was the pinball designer, who did Space Shuttle. He did Comet. He did what else did he do? Um, he did. I'm drawing a blank now. but he did Pinbot. He did these in classic tables. Space Shuttle was the table that saved Williams in 1984. And unless you're like into the pinball uh, thing in the pinball world,
Scene. Yeah.
a lot of
Mhm.
people don't know who Barry Osler is. And Barry Osler is like a pinball legend. He deserves to be remembered. Steve Kordick and Larry DeMar and Pat Lawler. These guys did these incredible machines. You know that were just brilliant, and they should be common. Their names should be household names as well. They should be everyone should know. For example, Pat Lawler and Larry DeMar designed Adams Family, which is the best-selling pinball game of all time.
Mhm.
At least in the modern era, since they started to keep those numbers. I mean, they are to pinball what Shigeru Miyamoto is to video games and Yu Suzuki are, and their names deserve to be up there. And it's unfortunate that they're not as well known outside of
Mhm.
pinball circles
Mhm.
as they should be.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's
So
what I
yeah,
wanted to do. I wanted to help get those stories out there and bring them to a more wider audience.
I get it. Yeah, it makes sense. And people so should definitely, check out. You, you can get them from Amazon, right? And here they
Hmm.
are, the four books available. And you should definitely check them out. And coming soon, the revised version of Playing at the Next Level. Yeah.
I would
Soon,
love to. I
TM.
really would.
Okay, awesome, Ken. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing this. So one of the reasons I invited you on the show, Ken, other than I wanted to you to come back and to talk to you again about Sega 16, and I actually hadn't realized that the website had turned 20 years old this year, which is amazing. And again, congratulations. But part of it was to also talk a little bit about the 35th anniversary of the release of the Sega Genesis. So in the US, obviously. Um, and to get a bit of a feeling from someone who lived that moment and that period of time, of how that was and the importance of that release. Because being in Europe, I have a little bit of a different experience. Obviously, the history here is a little bit different. Although
Hmm.
the Mega Drive is it probably even it was even bigger in a way here, since Nintendo's presence was not exactly the same, at least in Portugal. But I wanted to get your thoughts on a little bit of the history of the Genesis and how it impacted the gaming industry. So first of all, uh, you did you live like the launch of the
Oh
Genesis?
yes.
Yeah. Okay. Were
Yep.
you old enough to remember?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I was in high school.
Okay. Okay.
Hmm.
Excellent. So, how did you live those days? Was it like something big for you? Were you aware of the the impact that the Genesis would have, or Sega,
Oh,
or was it like something? Oh, there's a new console. Okay, let's try it.
well, I was always a Sega fan. I got my Sega Master System Christmas 1986, because I had originally wanted a Nintendo Entertainment System. I asked my father for Christmas in 1985, and my father didn't really think anything about video games back then. And it wasn't really where I lived. It wasn't really, a Nintendo. Okay, I just pitched it out there, threw it out there, and pitched it to him. And then in for my birthday, in August of 1985. I'm like, Dad, yeah, okay, yeah, people are buying a Nintendo. I want a Nintendo. Didn't get it for my birthday. For Christmas of 1985, of 86, I wanted a Nintendo Entertainment System. I guess he felt bad that he didn't get me one, but he took me to buy one on Christmas Eve. And we went to 11 different stores. No one had
Yeah,
one, obviously.
of
The
course.
Nintendo system was super hot back then. And so they had the Atari 2600 Junior. And the last store we went to, which was Lionel Playworld, because I had the good fortune of growing up in an era where we had Toys R Us, Child World, and Lionel Playworld. We had three huge big box stores. And so Lionel Playworld had two Master Systems left, and my father asked the worker, the employee, to take down the Master System from above the cabinet, and he put the Master System and the Atari 2600. My father said, "You can have an Atari 2600 Junior with 10 games because they were already on clearance. They were cheap.
Yeah.
Or you can have a Master System with one game."
Okay.
And I was like, "Well, I had an Atari 2600 before. I loved it. I was like, 10 games." But the Master System, those graphics. And then my brother leaned in and said, "If you get the Master System, I'll buy F-16 Fighting Falcon. We'll have four games." I was like, "Well, I'll take in the Master System." So I got the Master System, and I owned the Master System, and I collected games for it. I had something like 45 games for it, which in 1987, 1988, when you're 13 years old, to have 45 games in your game library was a flex,
That's
you know?
amazing. Yeah, yeah.
That was birthdays, Christmas. I mean, like, I don't want clothes. I want Sega Master System games. If I clean the house, wash the car and everything, my mom gave me $20, put that away. I did it again 2 weeks later, a month later. Boom, now I'm going to go buy Sega Master System games. So I had a huge library. I had the control stick. The only thing I didn't have at the time was the 3D glasses, but I did get those later. And so by the time the Sega Genesis came around, I was like, "Oh my, I want a Sega Genesis." But I was in high school and I didn't have any money. And so a new console, 189.99, that was a lot of money back then. And my mother, I grew up with a single mother. My mother couldn't afford to get me a Master System. So it's like I could ask my dad, but it took him a year to get me. I was asking for the Nintendo for a year. I don't know how long that's going to take. I guess though this time, um, I didn't ask for it when it came out because it had just come out in 1989, and I still had the Master System and everything, and I don't recall exactly why I didn't get it at launch, but I do believe it probably had to do something with my dad not being able to get it, and there was no way that I could afford it, so I just had to. And then Christmas, it didn't work out. But I did go to visit him and spend the summer with him in summer of 1990, and he was like, "No, we're getting you a Sega Genesis. You're getting a Sega Genesis." And I remember that I had bought with my own money. My friends and I had a deal. We always had a deal that none of us would buy the same game.
Okay. Oh,
If
that
you
makes
bought a
sense.
game, no one else in the group would buy that game because that way we could all, after we played them and beat them, we could swap, and then everybody gets to play everything, but you only
Yeah.
had to buy one. But the thing was, since I didn't have a console, everybody else had bought Thunder Force 2, and they had bought Space Harrier 2 and Golden Axe and Revenge of Shinobi and everything. So I ended up getting World Championship Soccer, which was the only game that nobody got. And I'm not a soccer fan, but I just wanted a Sega Genesis. And so when I went to visit my dad, one of my friend's brother gave me money and said, "Buy me a Sega Genesis game." And I said, "I'll do it on the condition that you let me open it and play it." And so he said, "Okay, you can overplay it." So I got him Super Hang On. So when my dad took me to buy the Sega Genesis, and he took me to 9 stores this time because he was not happy that they cost 189.99 in every single store, and he thought that was
Oh,
all the stores, you know, price fixing
fixing the
that
price.
it,
Yeah, yeah,
it, and I was like, "Dad, that's the manufacturer suggested retail price. Everybody's going to have it the same." So we ended up going to 9 stores. We went to Toys R Us was the first store. We went to 8 other stores, came back to Toys R Us, and we got the Sega Genesis, and I got Super Hang On, and I had brought World Championship Soccer with me. And so I spent that entire week playing Altered Beast, beat Altered Beast, went through the entire World Championship tournament in World Championship Soccer,
nice.
and then I just spent the rest of the week playing Super Hang On, and it was glorious. But I had to suffer because my friends, everyone in my group had a Sega Genesis, so I had to go to my friend's house and play Golden Axe there, and play Revenge of Shinobi, play Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle,
Because you couldn't
and,
buy them,
and
right? You couldn't buy them.
I couldn't I couldn't
Yeah,
buy them, so I had to go to all my friends'
that
house
was the
and
deal.
houses and play them there until I finally go. So I was actually the last one in my group because my friends all had because I have to put a little bit of context on this and that I at the time I was living in Puerto Rico as I am now. And Puerto Rico is part of the United States, but its sensibilities and its culture is very Latin American.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I notice is that I see all these videos and read about people talking about how, oh, no one I knew had a Sega Master System. Everybody had a Nintendo Entertainment System. And that's weird to me because in Puerto Rico, I knew lots of kids with Nintendo Entertainment Systems, but I knew at least seven, eight, nine people in my group alone that had a Master System. Like
Yeah,
Master
yeah.
System, there was no, you have a Master System, what's that? You went to the video store and the video store rented Master System games. There were at least three video stores in my area, in my town, that rented Master System games. So Master System and Nintendo are like, they were both there at the same time and lots of people had them. So it wasn't a weird thing to have a Master System. And
Yeah,
so,
same here. Same here. Yeah. It was weirder
you know,
probably to have an NES here. Uh,
yeah.
which
But
is
in the US, it
interesting.
was like, I talked to people and they're like, I didn't know anyone growing up that had a Sega Master System. And I'm like, that's weird because everybody I knew
Mhm.
had one, you know? So we all had Sega Master Systems and then they all just graduated to the Genesis. And I was the last one to do that, unfortunately. But yeah, that was always the plan. I was
Mhm,
always going
mhm.
to get a Sega Genesis. I just, growing up with a single mother, couldn't afford it. And then my
Yeah.
father, who took a year to get me the Nintendo, he took almost a year to get me the Genesis, but he did come through in the end, and he, was very. I think he felt bad about it, but he like got me the Sega Genesis, and so I was able to. And I still remember. I still have it in my head like it was yesterday. Taking it out of the box and seeing that controller, like that's mine. This is mine. I don't have to share it with anyone else, and that new console smell, which is so
Mhm.
wonderful, and connecting it to TV and everything. It was just so great to be able to, because I had lived with my grandparents when I came to Puerto Rico, because my mom stayed working so that she could save up money and then come and get a
Okay.
house here. And I came to live in Puerto Rico with my grandparents, and my grandparents were old school. You can't connect your games to the TV because you'll break the TV,
Okay.
or your consoles use too much electricity and then my electric bill's going to go up, and then her hair dryer uses more electricity than I could use in a month playing my Sega, you know and so to be able to, my dad was like, yeah, when he went to work that day, he had to work, and he's like, you're going to play your, hook it up, play it. And then he called me at lunch and asked me, so how's the console? You like it? I was like, yeah, I beat Altered Beast. He didn't know what the hell that was, but he was like, okay, good
Basically,
for
yeah,
you.
you're happy.
He
Nice.
basically called me up like the meme. Are you winning? Are you playing? You having fun? And it was great that I was able to just, because he had bought soda and ham and stuff for me, bread for me to make sandwiches. So I spent the whole day in his apartment just drinking soda and eating chips and sandwiches and playing Sega Genesis, and it was
Nice.
awesome.
That's a great memory. Awesome. Yeah. I love that the game that you had was World Championship Soccer. So when I first had or bought not bought, my dad bought it for me as well. My Mega Drive, in this case, it came packed in with Sonic 1 and Mega Games 1, which included here World Cup
Hmm.
Italia 90, right?
Hmm.
And Super Hang On as well, and columns, columns.
Oh
So, but
wow.
I know it's not. I mean, in Puerto Rico, isn't there like a big soccer culture? No, because of the Latin American roots. No.
No, well, people like soccer here, but what's really big here is baseball and
Baseball.
basketball
Okay.
and volleyball. Those are huge in Puerto Rico. But you do soccer is big here, but it's not as big as basketball because Puerto Rico has its own national basketball league and
Oh.
baseball league and volleyball. So those are,
Mm-hmm.
but soccer is big. But
Okay.
I grew up in the States. In the United States, soccer isn't that big. Football isn't that
Yeah.
big.
Yeah. Football.
So, but I was like, everybody had it, had all the other games. I was like, well, I'm gonna buy the one that no one else had. But I had fun and I enjoyed it. I was just so happy, like, I'm playing on my Sega Genesis, and
You
it,
would
and it
play
was it
anything.
is a good game. It is a good game.
Yeah, but you would play anything back in the day.
Hmm.
That's the fun of it. We're too picky today, but and it makes sense because we're like it's a different time and we have less time as well. We're
Hmm.
more selective, or at least we should be with how we spend our money. But I remember anything that people threw my way. My dad bought me a game that was like the most obscure game. I remember one of the worst the two worst games that I ever had for the Mega Drive were Captain Planet and the Planeteers and Superman, The Death of Superman? No. Can't remember.
Death and Return of Superman?
Death and Return of Superman, I think. I really didn't enjoy them, like in like having fun and having a good time playing these games. But I had them; they were new, so I played them all the time. So,
Hmm.
and I don't think I ever beat Superman, but I eventually beat Captain Planet. I was really proud of it. But I think that was the first time that I got the two games at the same time as I think like a birthday present or something. And that was the first time that I actually looked at a game, experienced a game, and said, "This is not that great of a game." I probably said this is a terrible game, but looking back, Superman, I think, truly is a bad game. Captain Planet, it's okay, maybe a little bit hard, but not that bad, I would say.
But at the time, that was all you had, and so you played
Yeah,
it.
I
And
played it.
and the thing is, we look back at a lot of those games now and say, "Oh my God, that game is horrible. How did I play that?" But it wasn't that bad at the time. We didn't know anything about
Yeah,
these
yeah,
games,
yeah.
So we would play like I look at games like on the Master System. I rented Miracle Warriors.
Hmm.
And I had no idea what I was. I rented King's Quest Five. I think it's the King Quest on the Master System. I had no idea what I was doing, playing these games because I didn't know anything about computer games or things like that. I had never played that type of RPG,
Hmm.
role playing game or that type of RPG. I played like Fantasy Star, that kind of Govelius, which was action RPG.
Hmm.
But and so even if I spent the whole weekend, I don't think I did more in Miracle Wars the weekend I rented it than just wander right outside town and fight monsters right there. I don't think I passed the first cave or the first dungeon, but I had fun. You didn't know what you were doing, but that, and
Yeah,
it
yeah.
was what you had, and so you had fun because you didn't know any better.
One of the memories that I have in terms of like not being able to play a game or something was Echo the Dolphin, the first Echo the Dolphin. I I found it extremely hard. I have no idea. So Portuguese is not my native language. So I have no idea how. First of all, I was able to understand anything as a like maybe probably 7 8 year old kid in living in Portugal. But I remember that wasn't the problem. The problem was the difficulty of like not
Hmm.
being able to breathe in the water and having to like time things perfectly and stuff. So I ended up trading it with there was like a section of trade-ins in a magazine, a Sega magazine that we had over here, and I ended up trading it for another game, which I didn't know if it was good or not. A Green Dog. I'm always telling this story on the show, but Green Dog. And was that a good trade? Probably not. But looking back, but I had fun with Green Dog, and I actually rebought Echo years later, and played Echo 2 and really enjoyed it. So it's all good. It's all good. We had fun. That's the most important thing,
Hmm.
right? So going back to the launch of the Genesis and looking at the titles, the launch titles here. So Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle, Altered Beast, Last Battle, Space Harrier 2, Thunder Force 2, Tommy Lasorda Baseball. These were the launch titles if my information is correct here in North America. Um Looking back and knowing what you know now, how strong was this lineup against the competition back in the day?
Well, I think it was strong in that they tried to cover as many genres as possible. You had sports games. Tommy Lasorda is still a fun, solid baseball game. It's just a very generic game with no team licenses or player licenses, but the gameplay and design is very solid. Alex Kidd, of course, Alex Kidd is a game. I don't know anyone who is meh with Alex Kidd. You either love it or you hate him,
Yeah.
right? Right? Altered Beast. I even wrote an article for Sega 16 about Altered Beast, about how Altered Beast was not designed to be a game you played for hours and hours and hours.
Hmm.
Altered Beast was was a game designed to show off the Sega Genesis.
Yeah.
It was designed to make it. That's why it was the pack-in, because it's only 5 levels. You beat it in 20 minutes, right? And it was designed to show you, look at the graphics, look at the size of the sprites, look at the voice, really clear,
We were
and
able to
it was
port this from the arcade, and you can have it at home, the same
at
experience,
home.
right? At home.
And it was made for you to say, look at this, how awesome this is. Now go buy more games. That's what it
Yeah.
was made for. So I think that it was about as solid as Sega could produce at the time. They covered all the genres. They had
Mhm.
arcade games, sports games, and things. But the fact that that they didn't have the third party support that they needed meant that the amount of titles that they could release at launch was very limited. So also Sega of America was very, very small at the time. They didn't really have then in 1989 they didn't have internal development teams like we have later on. The Sega Technical Institute wasn't a thing yet. Sega Multimedia Studio and other Sega Interactive Design. So a lot of the games are just localized versions of Japanese games. And many games, because one of the things that people don't understand is that the way you succeed with a console isn't necessarily to have the best games, right? As fans, if you're a diehard Nintendo fan, you're looking at the best games on the Nintendo. That's why when every time people talk about Nintendo, Super Nintendo, they talk about Link to the Past and Super Metroid and Earthbound. Yeah, but the general public doesn't care about Earthbound and Super Metroid. Go to any store, and what are the titles you see that are traded in the most? They're all Barbie and Lego license. They're all licensed
Yeah.
games, right?
Hmm.
Because when mom and dad go to buy little Jimmy a game, they're not looking for Super Metroid and Link to the Past. A lot of times, they're looking for whatever cartoon he's watching at the time, or whatever toy he's into at the time. Oh, Transformers! Here's a Transformer game, even if it's garbage, right? So the object is not to have necessarily the best games, but to have the most amount of games, so
Hmm.
that when mom and dad take little Jimmy to the store to buy a console, they look at this console that has 10 or 15 games, and they look at this one that has 50, 60, 70 games.
Yeah.
That's the one they're going to buy. And that's what made the Sega Genesis successful, is that they had more games. When the Super Nintendo launched, they had more games. Did they have better games? Well, a lot of those games probably weren't better, but they had more of them, and that's what parents looked for when they went to the store
Hmm.
to get
Hmm.
them. It was better to have 50 B games than 5 A games, because first of all, little Jimmy's not going to buy,
Yeah.
that many games. And parents don't know what a triple A game is, or a B game or C game is. They don't know and especially back then, you didn't have the internet and
There was no
YouTube and Let's
information.
Plays and
Yeah.
things. So
Exactly.
you look at the back of the box and it's like, hey, you like Transformers, or you like He-Man or whatever, Thundercats, whatever, and this is a game. Okay, we'll buy it. Do you want that one? And of course, what game, I as a parent, when I took my kids to buy games, like, what do you want? And like, I want this game, I want Bratz. My daughter loved the Bratz games, and I'm, even without the YouTube and everything, having grown up buying games, I go, when she wants Bratz, I'm like, oh god,
Yeah,
you know but that's what she
yeah.
wants, right? That's
Yeah.
what she wants. So I'm going to buy a copy of Bratz Rock Angels on the GameCube for my daughter, because that's what she wants, you know? And so if
These
you
days
look at
it's
the
probably
collection of
Paw
games, that's
Patrol
the
or
type of games they
anything.
had,
Yeah.
So they didn't have that yet.
Hmm.
They didn't have that yet. They couldn't have these massive amounts of third party games and stuff. So they had to rely on localized games, and they had to make sure they had as many games as possible.
Hmm.
And that's why, for not just the Genesis, but for a lot of consoles, the launch lineups are usually, pretty weak. I mean, that's why a lot of people talk about the Dreamcast lineup, but the
Yeah.
Dreamcast lineup, that's 1999 in the United States. You already have the internet by then, and things like that. So it was a lot easier for companies, and also you also have experience of having consoles, right? By then the Sega had already had the Master System, the Genesis, Sega CD 32X, Game Gear, Saturn, and so they knew what to do and what not to do. But in 1989, when they're going to release the Genesis, all you have is the Master System. So Sega, all they know is what worked with the Master System, what didn't work in the Master System. They
Hmm.
don't have the level of information that we have today with consoles and stuff. So I think that the console launch, it was as strong as they could make it. I look back at those first generation Genesis games with great fondness. I just love the graphical style, the sound. You can you can hear Space Harrier 2 or Thunderforce 2 games from that era, and you can say that's a launch era Genesis game because the sound like no get Fantasy Star 2 that era that first year of the Genesis, the sound kind of like I don't know if it's just me, but the sound and the graphical style like kind of changed after that, and you never saw that again. I listened to Fantasy Star 2 soundtrack and the sounds, just the sound effects in the
Hmm.
game. And there are a lot of sounds that you just don't hear later on, you know? And so, they had a strong console, but, they did what they had to do. And those games, I think a lot of those games still hold up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think so too, right? And even
I like
today,
Space Harrier too.
I like Space Harrier 2 as well. Uh, Unpopular opinion, I don't know. I do like. I enjoy
And
playing Altered Beasts from time to time.
mhm.
Alex Kidd in the
Last
Enchanted
Battle,
Castle. I prefer Miracle World, but it's yeah,
me too.
it's okay. I think
But
most
Last
people.
Battle, for example, Last Battle, people used to make fun of that game, but I was playing it a couple of months ago, and I was thinking, was this really any worse than some of the side-scrolling action games that we were renting on the Nintendo Entertainment System or on the Master System? It was
Yeah,
side-scrolling action. It was very generic, wasn't very, but it wasn't bad. I mean, it was a solid rental. If I were a kid and I rented Last Battle for the weekend, I wouldn't have been disappointed. You know,
and you
I
had a little
think I
bit
wouldn't
of
have been excited,
everything,
but
right?
hmm
Like you had like a side-scrolling beat 'em up. You had a platformer,
uh-huh.
Altered Beast, more arcadey, but
Boss
still,
fights.
yeah.
Mhm.
Shoot 'em up, Thunder Force, Space Harrier, I like arcadey type as
Mhm.
well. Sports, so yeah, yeah, you had a little bit of everything. So good job, Sega of America back in the day
Mhm.
on doing this. Yeah, I was looking at the difference between the North American and European launch titles. Yeah, the European one is a little bit meatier, so to speak.
Mhm.
Yeah, Golden Axe, Rambo 3, Revenge of Shinobi, Super Hang On, Super Thunderblade, Truxton, yeah,
Truxton.
Zoom,
Truxton is underappreciated.
Golden Goose, Golden Ghost. Truxton is under probably.
I like Truxton.
Yeah,
And of course, Ghouls and Ghosts is an amazing port for the time.
yeah, for sure. Really hard, but that's it's supposed to be hard. So yeah, that's what makes it good.
Well, I remember playing that game in the arcade and
Hmm.
beating that game on one quarter. I mean, like practicing and practicing because back in the day, if you were the first one to beat a game, that was street cred at school.
Yeah, for sure.
And every time they brought a new game, there were people in your school that would compete to try and be the first one to beat it. And I remember that where I live, Ghouls and Ghosts, the only games that I was the first one to ever beat were Ghouls and Ghosts and Hippodrome, which is also known as Fighting Fantasy,
Mm.
which was just a basic tournament fighter of you fighting mythological monsters. And Ghouls and Ghosts was like, I beat Ghouls and Ghosts because I could never beat Ghosts and Goblins. Arcade, Nintendo Entertainment System, it was just too hard. Could never beat it. But Ghouls and Ghosts was a little bit easier, and I was able to beat it. So when it came to the Sega Genesis, I was very excited to play that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Again, the arcade experience at home, right? That was a big thing back in the day, back in the 90s, and Sega were doing that. So that was part of the reason for the success as well. Um, Especially in places where arcade games were big, like in the US, I think, and here as well, but maybe not so much. When I say here, Portugal, that's a very specific culture and the reality that we had over here. But it was still important, still important. Um, One of the things that and you talk about this in the book as well, and people know about this like from the console wars book and everything. The marketing strategy, especially from the time that Tom Kalinske took over and with Al Nilsson by his side and everything, the marketing strategy was really aggressive, right? Having lived through that period of time and experienced the ads and the campaigns, uh, how effective was that back in the day, Ken, in your opinion?
Well, I remember that the aggressive. We noticed, my friends and I at least noticed that Sega was like really like was aggressive, more aggressive, with the Genesis does.
Yeah.
And that under Michael Katz. I know we didn't know at the time. I learned who Michael Katz was when I got the first issue of Sega Visions. I sent him my Sega Visions. I sent them the registration card, and I got an issue of Sega Visions, which came out whenever they felt like bringing it out. Sometimes you'd come out every 2 months. Sometimes you get two in an entire year.
Okay.
And when you opened at the first issue, it had a picture of Michael Katz sitting on the desk with a Sega baseball cap, I think. And that's what's like, oh, okay, that's the guy running Sega of America. And then we saw this the Genesis does ads in the magazines and the commercials on TV, and it was like, wow, like that's gutsy because Nintendo was king.
Hmm.
You would go to the stores and they had World of Nintendo at Toys R Us and everything. And so to see Sega be that way was really like was nice. But then of course you looked at it at the time, at least my friends and I, we were like, what do they have to lose? What's going to happen if they do it? People not going to buy their console, or stores not going to bring their consoles. I mean,
Hmm.
because they're already, fighting an uphill battle. So, why not go directly and be aggressive? I think that's what you needed to do because they say, um, that Nintendo was the Goliath and Genesis Sega was the David, and it was it was the underdog. But you have to make a lot of noise when you're the underdog. When you're Nintendo and you control 90% of the retail market in the United States, you don't have to scream and yell. You know, but Sega did, and so that that was part of what um, got the Genesis to become successful. There were a lot of other things
Hmm.
involved in like swapping out Altered Beast for Sonic the Hedgehog, and getting the console into Walmart, which was a big thing. But I think that the whole aggressiveness that you saw under Kalinsky and Nielsen, that when Nielsen was there when Katz was there, so he
Yeah.
was
Yeah. Yeah.
part of the
Hmm.
Genesis does
Hmm.
as well. But that whole go directly to Nintendo was something that you didn't really see in the video game magazines. If you go back and look at video game magazines from the 80s, 90s, you'll see an ad for one console next to another, and they're just like, here's my product. Well, here's my product. You decide, you know. And then after that, you begin to see after the Genesis, you begin to see like the Neo Geo ads directly attacking the other consoles, right? I don't. I think it was it the 3DO that had that ad? That had a toy chest, and they throw a Super Nintendo into the toy chest, and they throw the Genesis, with the Sega CD attached. Like these are children's toys. I don't remember exactly if that was a 3DO or a Neo Geo one. And these are kids' toys. I think it was the Neo Geo, and that was like just coming up and slapping them in the face, right? And
Yeah.
you didn't see that really before the Genesis does, at least in the console sphere.
Hmm.
And I think that was something that had to be done. They had to change the way people saw consoles because there was no way you couldn't go up to retailers and say, "Please carry my console," because they would say no. They didn't want to make Nintendo mad. So you had to make the consumer
Exactly.
want the console. So
Yeah.
the consumer would walk into Walmart and say, "Hey, I'd like to get I want a Sega Genesis. You don't have a Sega Genesis? Why don't you have a Sega Genesis?" And if that happened enough, then the store would say, "Wait a minute. If they're not buying it from me, they're buying it from somebody else. I should bring that."
Yeah.
And so that was a way to take it directly to the consumer.
Hmm.
And but at the time, we just thought it was like, oh wow, that's gutsy that they're actually taking on attacking Nintendo that way. It's like the little dog nipping at your ankles, but hey, he's making a lot of noise. Let's see what happens. But
Hmm.
I don't think any of us at the time thought like, oh, this is gonna lead to something really big. We were just happy to see that Sega was still fighting, and that it was still there
Yeah.
because like I
Because you
said,
you
my
were
friends,
you were
we
on the
had
Sega
Nintendo, we had
side,
Sega.
so to speak, right? You were
Yeah,
already on
yeah.
the Sega side.
I was a Sega guy.
Did you
I was
see
a Sega
that
guy.
that strategy like influencing anyone that had like an NES or something?
Well,
Think, oh, maybe
the
I should actually
friends,
buy a Genesis now.
the friends that I had that had an NES were going to stick with their NES because, kids drew sides on the playgrounds and,
Usually, yeah.
and that's where they stood. But, but I did notice that where before there were some kids that would say, Sega sucks, Nintendo's better. Now, when they saw the commercials, and if they came over your house and you said, "Hey, check this out," and you would play the Genesis, they were more open to it. And in fact, I had one of my closest friends was a Nintendo guy through and through, but he used to come over to my house and play Sega all the time. And sometimes, like, I would lend him my Sega Genesis with my games, and he'd lend me his NES.
Okay.
And he'd spend the weekend playing Sega, and he was like diehard Nintendo. But he would play. I mean, I beat a lot of my like I beat Ease, Vanished Omens on the Master Systems, Govelius, Fantasy Star Two. I think a Sword of a Million, Shining in the Darkness. He and I together beat those games, taking turns and telling, "Oh, try this, look at this. You look at the manual, tell me what this item does." We playing them together, and he was
Yeah.
a really really strong Nintendo fan, and he would come over to my house to play Sega all the time. And
Nice.
that was something that I saw that during the Master System days I didn't see that.
Mm.
You know, my friends, I had friends who had Master Systems, and I had friends who had Nintendo. I didn't have friends that had both. But when the Genesis, came out, that's when I started to see friends that had an NES and a Sega Genesis.
Yeah.
And or that were had NES, but they weren't talking as much smack about the Sega Genesis as they did about the Master System. There was more respect. They put
Yeah.
respect on Sega's name.
Yeah.
So
Nice.
that was one thing I did see at the time.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to get the perspective from a person who actually lived there that period of time and like experienced this thing like in the battlefield, uh, so to speak. Awesome. Yeah, yeah, and it was a good point you mentioned before that like Nintendo was like their commercial practices were borderline, more probably not even borderline, like really illegal at times in terms of dealing with like the retailers and stuff, and like
Hmm.
forbidding them from uh, having Sega console or the Genesis in
Well,
their
they
stores
wouldn't
and stuff.
forbid you. They would just say, "Yeah, you can
Like
sell it if you want, but it would
blackmail
be a
them.
shame if you didn't get your product for Christmas this year. It
Yeah,
accidentally
yeah.
went to another your competition. So what
Exactly,
do you do?"
exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, that's a good point. You have to bring it directly to the consumer. So, yeah, that's a very good point. Okay, yeah. Um, Looking back now, Ken, and as a person who is experienced in like researching not just the Genesis, but Sega and the video game industry as a whole, uh, what do you think remains from that uh, the Genesis launch and the period of time when we had the Genesis and the Mega Drive? What was the cultural, the impact, the influence of that console and of Sega's strategy at the time in the whole of the video game industry? Would you say?
I think the biggest impact the Sega Genesis had, there were two big impacts that the Sega Genesis had on culture. The first was that it was probably the first console to actually really make video games a mainstream thing. I mean, video games were a big industry,
Hmm.
but for video games to be a part of popular culture, I think the Sega Genesis was probably the first console to really do that, and that has a lot to do with it being at the right place at the right time, right? Because Sega's audience in 1992 and 93 were the kids who had grown up with Nintendo, but they were now older and they
Hmm.
wanted more mature games. So the audience that were kids in the 80s were now teenagers in the 90s. These kids already played video games. You're offering something now that's made for them at a time where they're getting into music and they're into movies and things like that. So you're going along on that ride as like the video game part of it. So these kids didn't leave video games behind. They just graduated to a more mature console. That's the way it was sold,
Hmm.
And so to make video games a big part of that culture, what was part of was the I think that was its cultural impact. In terms of the video game industry, the fact that it broke Nintendo's monopoly. So, if you're trying to be the number one thing, the fact that Sega came and broke that, you know, it wasn't the number one thing for a couple of years. And
Hmm.
Sega actually outsold them for a couple of years there in a row at Christmas. And then you had the PlayStation come along and outsell everybody. And if it hadn't been for the Sega breaking Nintendo's armor, the PlayStation would not have had the success that it had.
For sure.
Xbox wouldn't have been as successful as it had. So the fact that it broke that monopoly, I think, is the greatest impact it had on the industry. Too many times people talk about how, well, Nintendo won, Sega lost, and so it lost, right? And it was a failure. Well, just because you're not number one doesn't mean you're a failure, right? Because using that logic, then you would have to say that the Nintendo 64 was a failure. The GameCube was a failure. The Wii U was a failure because they weren't the number one consoles. Nintendo made a lot of money with those consoles. They were successful consoles. They just weren't the number one. It is possible for the industry to support more than one console and for companies to make lots of money not being number one. Of course, everyone wants to be number one, but that
Yeah.
doesn't mean you can't be successful and make money, right? And that's something like with and shameless plug for my next book. Um, the I'm writing about the Game Gear, and when people say, "Well, the Game Gear was swallowed up and it was a failure because the Game Boy outsold it 10-1," it did. It did outsell the Game Gear 10-1, but Sega made a lot of money with the Game Gear. In fact, I think only the Sega Genesis was it the Sega Genesis and I think the Master System, yeah, the Master System Sega Genesis are the only Sega consoles that had a longer lifespan than the
Okay.
Game Gear. The Game Gear was on the market longer than the Saturn was, longer than the Dreamcast was, and so they made a lot of money.
Hmm.
They weren't number one, but they sold enough for it to be successful. So it is possible for you to be profitable and successful and not be number one, and that's something that Sega I think showed because during the 80s, like, yeah, you had the ColecoVision, you had the Intellivision, but Atari was everywhere. Atari was, it just dominated. And then Nintendo dominated. And I think, with people tend to tend to think that if you didn't have a Nintendo, you didn't have video games. Like your parents would say, turn off your Nintendo. It's like, Mom,
Yeah.
it's a Sega Master System. And she didn't know that. It's like it was a Nintendo. It was a video game, it
It's
was
a
a
video
Nintendo,
game. It's a
you know,
Nintendo. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and so Sega helped show that the Genesis helped show that hey, there's more than one player in the industry, which is what we saw from then on, right? In with the PlayStation, the 32-bit era, you had three consoles, and even the Saturn, outside of Japan, didn't do well at all. But the Nintendo 64 lasted, for 4.5, 5 years, right? And then you had the PlayStation 2, and you had the Xbox, right? That lasted was successful to this day. You have X Series X, Xbox X. You have the PlayStation 5. You have the Nintendo Switch.
Hmm.
And today
Yeah.
people have multiple consoles that would not probably have happened, I think, if Sega hadn't broken that model and shaken up the industry to show, hey, there can be more than one player here
They
and
set
be
a
successful.
precedent, a very important precedent for sure. Yeah. 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 Funny you mentioned like the Nintendo being like synonymous with video games. In my household, even like in the Dreamcast days, turn off your Sega. Uh, Never thought about that.
Yeah, in Europe,
That's
I
how different
imagine it
things
would be.
work. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, but those are two very good points here in terms of the impact of the Genesis in the industry. Yeah, and I think people. I mean, it's like you said. Like if you don't win, you're not successful. Yeah, it depends. That's the mindset that we have right now again, and I think like even with the Xbox trailing behind the Nintendo Switch and the PS5, and like it's okay. It's still a profitable business, like the Xbox games division, even if they don't sell a lot of consoles when compared to the other two. But still, even like internally, the company seems to be like they feel like they've been defeated, and their business
Hmm.
decisions show that. So the mindset of you have,
Everyone wants to be number one, right?
yeah,
But and the reason for that is because probably the president of Microsoft, of Xbox, the Xbox division, looks at the numbers and says, "We're making money," but that's a company that responds to shareholders, right? And so
exactly,
shareholders
exactly.
they want, you have to be the one, you have to make us as much money. They don't see it as we're making a lot of money. They're saying they look at it as like we should be making more money, you
And
know?
we should
And
be
so
making
that's a
more
problem.
money than last year,
Hmm.
which is
Yeah,
another
that's
problem.
that's a problem.
Yeah.
But and so like that's why you're seeing a lot of, all these studios laying people off and closing. And I think that could probably be a blessing in disguise, in that you're also seeing a lot of these developers who got fired or lost their jobs are just saying, you know what, I'm just going to make games for myself.
Hmm.
And so you're having all these smaller studios, and that goes back to like the Master System in the Genesis days when the studio had 5 people, 6 people
Yeah.
made a game,
Hmm.
and so the games don't have to cost $200 million to be successful. They just have to have a a good, they have to play well and they have to be fun. That's it, really. And
I
so,
think it's the
and you,
exact opposite. I think the business model of the AAA game isn't sustainable in the long run.
no,
So
no, it's not. It's not. It's not
because
sustainable.
if a game costs like $200 million or whatever to make, it's really hard to justify it not selling well or it not being like a blockbuster hit, right? So
Well, it's like movies.
exactly,
Same thing with movies.
yeah.
Like they make a movie that costs $300 million to make, and it costs another $150 million to market. That movie has to make $500 million just to break even.
Hmm.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah,
That's absolutely ridiculous. That's not sustainable.
exactly, exactly. So I totally agree. Like smaller studios, indie developers, and the indie scene is the most creative of them all, which is it makes sense, right? Because the
Look at the Sega Genesis right now, and the games
exactly.
that we're still getting. Games like Xenocrisis, games like Rocket Panda, games like Tanzer, right? All these games made by small independent studios, and they're awesome. They're awesome, you know? So
Shout out to
I think
Rocket
that
Panda.
maybe,
Yeah.
yes, yes. I just put up Sega 16. I just put up a review for Rocket Panda
Yep.
today,
Yep.
you
I
know?
saw that.
uh, uh, so these games are wonderful. They're fun. They're very solid, very well made.
Hmm.
And they're small studios. They're not 150 people. And so I think that's we're going to have to move back towards that.
Hmm.
So that's like I see with the Sega, like even after all these years, Genesis does right. It's still doing,
There you
showing how
go.
it's done.
Yeah, and that's actually a good segue into another question that I was going to ask you. So, how do you look at the homebrew or indie scene? All these games that,
Well,
like you just said, right? They're making great games at a smaller budget and being
I,
creative.
when I first started Sega 16, we had an article series for these types of games called Hacks and Homebrews.
Yeah.
And it has evolved so much. The scene has evolved so much that you have hacks and you have home brews. But games like Rocket Panda that have a studio that makes the game and is contracted with a publisher to publish it,
Hmm.
and it's released commercially. Those are I prefer to call those aftermarket games.
Okay.
Those are
Yeah.
games that's different from a homebrew title, I think.
Hmm.
But I have bought more Genesis games this year than I have PlayStation games. I mean, I got Cursed Knight, I got Sacred Line 2, I got Rocket Panda, I got what else did I just get? I'm looking at my shelf right here that I have them. Um, oh, I know I just got recently got another game. Um, and well, no, those were the games I got. But like I backed on
You backed
Kickstarter,
Brock
like
exactly.
ZPF.
CPF. Yeah.
What else? There's
Esther Bros? No. That's
Oh,
the
Demons of Asterborg, that in Esterbros. Those were the other two that I got.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so like there are all these games that are coming out, all these games that are being released, and they're quality games that if I went and brought if I could go back in time and show Xenocrisis to anyone at they would have lost their
Yeah,
minds.
yeah.
They would have lost their minds, or even Rocket Panda. They're just very well made games because they've gone back to the basics, which is a small group of people who have developed a project that they believe very strongly in. And if you, I don't know, I know in English there are sayings like this. Every language probably has a saying, but yeah, I think in English the saying is too many cooks spoil the pot or something spoil the
Okay,
broth.
yeah.
It's when you have too many people involved in a game, it starts to lose its focus, and everyone wants to give their own opinion of things,
Yeah.
and it spoils the magic, right? When you've got a title that has three, four, five people on it, it's a lot easier to hold that, keep it strong. And so you're seeing a lot of these indie studios like Mega Cat Studios and
Mhm.
Space Pants Games and others that are just
Even
really
Yuzo
just doing
Koshiro is
amazing.
making a new game.
Even Yuzo Koshiro is, because, and the thing is, you're seeing that guys like Yuzo Koshiro who worked on big budget games are
Mhm.
like, I miss the nice small atmosphere of making a game, and they're going back to. I mean, Xenocrisis, the art's done by Hank Norberg, right? I mean, he's
Mhm.
a big pixel artist that worked on. I don't remember if he was on Metal Slug or he was part of that studio. I mean, that in the Hunt. At Irem, these big guys that are like, yeah, I'll work on your small little indie project because it goes back to that time when they were in the industry when that's how you made games. And I think that gaming has lost that because everything just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think the reason why consoles like the Jaguar, I have an Atari Jaguar, just recently got a Jaguar CD that actually works. And the reason why I got the Atari Jaguar is specifically because of all the aftermarket games being released at Atari Age and Songbird Productions and all these other tiny companies that are releasing games like Gravitic Minds and Rebooteroids, that are just super fun, and these games keep coming out. They have a very strong aftermarket community, and like so, I can literally have like an Evercade, a Jaguar, a Sega Genesis, and maybe a PlayStation or an Xbox, and that's it. I'm good because they're just those. They're going to keep making games, and I'm never going to be able to play them all.
Yeah, yeah.
Because there's
I
just
was
still so
actually
many Genesis games coming out.
the Dreamcast is the same. I was actually
Uh huh.
listening to the latest episode of our good friends, the Dreamcast Junkyard's Dream Pod. They have the Dream
Hmm.
Pod, and every time they have a new episode, they go through like the latest news, and the news is always like, "There's this game and this game and this game coming and this game and this game." And they have like, so we have too many games. We have so little time. Let's just go through this very quick fire. This, because there
Hmm.
are indeed a very big number of games coming to these consoles, like in the
I'm
aftermarket,
just I'm
like you were saying.
I'm just so surprised at how strong
Mhm.
the Genesis community is. It's wonderful. And I look at, like, for example, the Super Nintendo doesn't have anything like that. And that makes me sad. I wish
Mhm,
that
mhm,
that the Super Nintendo had a thriving aftermarket community like that. And I wish that the 3DO did. And I wish that all the people, that these consoles still had games coming
mhm,
out for them,
mhm,
because it shows you, like, the potential, the missed potential. The Jaguar is a good example. That was a console that, I remember when it came out. Um, that was a console that one friend bought, and everybody, and then he traded to somebody else, and traded somebody else, traded somebody else, and they traded it to me, and I traded somebody else. And that, I remember that the 3DO and the Virtual Boy were consoles that only one was bought, but everybody owned it because we just kept trading it to each other. Like, okay, I played it. No, I don't want it anymore. You have it. And so, like, Jaguar was just, it was a joke to a lot of
mhm.
people. And so, but now, I'm looking at the Jaguar aftermarket scene, and I'm like, yeah, the Jaguar had potential. There was a
Yeah.
lot that could have been done with this console that we're seeing now. It's like, there's some good games coming out. And I was like, I want to get a Jaguar again. And I was like, wow, I can't believe I said that. You know? And now I've had it, and I'm really enjoying it because I'm playing all these great aftermarket indie games that are coming out now. And the Sega Genesis, I just like, this console will not die. Just will not
Yeah,
die.
for sure, for sure. Yeah, yeah. People should actually check this out because or all of these games out because it's incredible what these small studios are making games that can be played on actual hardware, like and
Hmm.
incredibly looking, play really well, excellent soundtracks as well. So yeah, definitely thing to be on the lookout for. If you want to like if you're disillusioned with the current state of gaming, just go back to the
You
retro
could
scene.
buy a Sega Genesis and he'll only get rid of everything else. Just keep your Sega Genesis and say, I'm only going to buy new Sega Genesis games from now on. And you will be buying three, four, 5 games a year.
At least.
Which doesn't sound like much, but when you think
No,
about
no,
this as a
no.
console that was discontinued, you
Yeah,
know,
that's for sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
26 years ago or so, that's remarkable.
I find myself backing more and more Kickstarter projects like every year, I think. And the good thing
Mhm.
is they're actually funded and they keep their word and we get the games, so it's nice. It's
Well, you
a
have
good time
games,
too.
like Big Evil Corporation and Mega Cat
Hmm.
Studios that are really trying to do that, and
Hmm.
games like Tanglewood, which
Yeah,
are just
that's an
amazing,
amazing game. Yeah.
that I really, really wish that they got more press because they deserve to get more attention.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, for sure. Awesome. So Ken, we really need to wrap this up shortly. I have like one final question. I usually ask the blast processing question, but you probably answered it twice already. So I'll have another like very existential moment question. Where would you be without the Sega Genesis?
Where would I be? Wow. I think that if the Sega Genesis had not come out, I would probably be a huge TurboGrafx
Okay.
fan. Because I remember I was I was the only one of my friends that didn't have a Sega Genesis, but I did have a friend who had a TurboGrafx. And so I was like, well, maybe I should get a TurboGrafx. And I was kind of thinking between the two and ironically, it was Rambo 3 that convinced me, no, I got to get a Sega Genesis.
Oh, really?
I saw the first boss battle, of Rambo shooting his bow at the
Yeah,
helicopter.
yeah, 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 yeah,
And
yeah.
that was just, wow, that was amazing to me. It's like, okay, I got to get I did eventually get a TurboGrafx later on, which is a wonderful system, but I would probably be running Turbo 16 if it hadn't been if
Yeah.
it hadn't been for the Sega Genesis. I think that's probably the one I would have gone with because I love the TurboGrafx too.
Congrats on the 20th anniversary of turbo16.com.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Awesome. So before we actually do wrap this up, where can people find you? What do you want to tell the people listening or watching to this episode of the Sega Lounge? Plug
um,
away, my
Se-
friend.
Sega 16. If you want to email us, you can email is using the contact form on the website. The forums are active. The forums have been completely updated, relaunched. We're on new servers. The website is on a new server. The forums on a new server. So all of the technical problems we had in the past, because we were on a private server, that was very difficult to maintain. That's gone. We're on the latest software. Sega 16's forum is active. If I know a lot of people are on Discord, they love Discord, but forums I still think are very, very important because they're the place where conversations um, are easier to find. If you're not a member of
Hmm.
Discord, you can't access it, right? And you can't search for the private nature of Discord servers make it very difficult to find topics and things on Google, right? Forums, will appear. Still have a very uh, uh, dedicated community, not as large as it once were. That's what's happened with forums everywhere. But, we're always accepting new members. Come on over to the forums and discuss, your love of Sega, the way we did back in 2004.
For sure, for
We
sure.
had
Yeah.
started the forum. It didn't have a lot of people, but the ones that were there were very active, and that's where we're at. We've come full circle.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Awesome. And so you mentioned the Game Gear book that you're working on.
Mhm.
Any like, is there like a plan, like a release
Yeah,
date already in your mind?
well, I have to hand the manuscript in by December 31st, so the book will be out next year.
Okay.
It is a book in the same style as my other books that covers the comprehensive history of the Game Gear's launch, release, development, and release in Japan, the United States, Brazil, Europe, Australia, and South Korea. And it covers, I've interviewed around 40 different people involved with the Game Gear in all of those regions, except for South Korea. I haven't found anyone from South Korea. Uh, Translation of a lot of documents that have never been
Mhm.
translated before. I think it's probably the most in-depth thing written about the Game Gear. There's a section of notable games that talks about over 60 Game Gear titles that are exclusive to the console. And it's if you like my other books and you like deep dives into the history, researched history of it, then I think you'll like this. I have about 83,000 words written already, which is pretty good for I think that's probably more than everything that's been written about the Game Gear combined. People don't seem to want to talk about the Game Gear. I love the console, and I think that that's another area that no one's talked about that way, and so that's why I wanted to do that. So it should be out hopefully sometime, probably late next year.
Mhm.
It'll be
I
out.
I feel like the Game Gear is a big gap in my Sega knowledge. So I think like my Sega education, as I usually say. So I think this will be a very good addition to the library and a good way to Sega educate myself. So I'm looking forward to it. And you have to come back then to talk a little bit about that.
Oh, of course. Be
Yeah,
happy to.
awesome. So, Ken, thank you very much for coming on the show. Thank you for sharing. Again, and this time for real, congrats on the 20th anniversary of not Turbo 16, but Sega16.com. And people listening to us, watching, check out Sega-16.com and follow Ken and check out his books. Thank you very much for watching, listening, everyone. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Sega Lounge. As I said before, do check out our YouTube channel. It's like a work in progress, adding stuff as I can. Time is limited, but I'm trying to upload like clips and stuff. Probably this interview will be available in video form in its totality on the YouTube channel. And also next week, we have our yearly Sage Expo episode. So speaking of like homebrew games, hacks, and like indie games, do check us out then. We have a very interesting panel discussion highlighting some of the games in the Sage Expo this year. So do check it out. Yeah. Ken, again, thank you very much. Take care. See everyone next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Sega Lounge, hosted by me, KC, and part of Radio Sega's network of live shows and podcasts. Theme song and incidental music by OSC. Got any suggestions? Drop me an email to podcast@thesegalounge.com. Find us at The Sega Lounge on X, Twitter, and Instagram, at thesegalounge.com on Blue Sky, and be sure to check out our Twitch and YouTube channel for live video content. You can find previous episodes of the show by going to thesegalounge.com, on the Terra Player app, and wherever you listen to podcasts. A Mixed On Productions podcast.